Religion and science. This is going to be a fireside chat. We're going to be speaking with Dr. Rennie Thomas, Assistant Professor, Sociology and Social Anthropology at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, ISER Bhopal, who's going to be in conversation with Jacob Koshi, Deputy Science Editor, The Hindu. Science and religion are often seen as opposites, yet history shows a more nuanced relationship. This session explores how scientists' beliefs shape their work and how journalists navigate the intersection of science and religion in their reporting.
As Shruti introduced, religion and science. Now, this is a question uh, with, with unique dimensions, particularly in India. And I thought that there would be nobody more appropriate than having Professor Rennie Thomas to discuss this. Primarily because he comes from a background that deals on, and he's a researcher and an investigator of the sociology of science, the practice of science in India. Now, if you look at any field, it is very rare that we have experts or we have researchers who are able to look at a field from the outside. I mean, yes, as journalists, as science journalists, we especially when you spend some years doing what you do, you tend to get a feel of how scientists go about their work. Do they have their own biases about things? Do they occupy a realm of ether different from other people, etc.? But to study this question in a very methodical way requires, I believe, somebody with a training who comes from a training of sociology. And this is a very vibrant field. I don't know how vibrant Rennie could actually discuss that. At least in the 60s and 70s, this was a big field of investigation in the West. I don't know how prolific or seriously researched this field is in India. But this is the reason why it's a pleasure to have Rennie over here. This is a trajectory story, how we talk about religion and science. Humanity once lived in the dark ages. We were all, we depended upon the gods, and the gods, gave flame and fire and intelligence, and we learned things, and but we were still stuck in darkness, and religion kind of governed every aspect of humanity, even knowledge. Then we had, in the European context, you had an enlightenment, and then you had the scientific revolution. Now, what was interesting to me is also that, look at, there are many monks or Christian monks actually, who have actually been credited with some of the advances in science. I mean, you have Gregor Mendel, who painstakingly grew all those peas in pods and, set about the field of evolution. You have Georges Lemaitre, the Belgian priest who is credited with actually coining or visualizing the Big Bang. You have Francis Mersenne, of the mathematicians among you, of the Mersenne primes. I mean, here we have a lot of monks, Christian religious people, who actually ended up seeding ideas that that had a bearing in science. So, Remy, my first question is: do you think by the 1900s and the 2000s, did scientists eventually replace the clergy, the power that the clergy had, in Europe in deciding true and false and knowledge? Did scientists replace them and become a new clergy?
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for thinking my name. I just want to say that actually I represent a particular discipline which is kind of closer to what you do. It is a discipline called Science and Technology Studies. It's essentially what sociologists, anthropologists, historians, and philosophers look at science from a critical point of view. Just to keep that point clear, that I represent the discipline of Science and Technology Studies. Now, yes, the first question that Jacob has just asked is very significant. This is a question that always we start with any debate on science and religion. Now, it's very clear if you look at any historians, the serious historians of science who look at science and religion, that this teleology was not actually correct. I mean, let's not talk about the monks, but even if you talk about some of the most fascinating scientists, what they're called as the natural philosophers of those days, now, of course, we use the word science, but the word science wasn't even there before 19th century, right? The usage scientist was done for the first time in the 19th century at a meeting at the Royal Society of London. So before that, they were all
There's a
natural
physical
philosophers.
location where it was
Yes.
found. Okay.
Yeah. Before that, it was all natural philosophers, right? They were doing both religion and science together. This teleology that there is suddenly a conflict was not actually historically right in many ways. Of course, the word conflict was used for the first time in the context of United States of America, where a writer writes this book called, a conflict between science and religion. That's the first time. In fact, it's from there that this usage of science goes into different places. You have many important works that comes out to talk about science and religion, conflict between science and religion, compatibility between science and religion, etc. So there is a particular genealogy. So when we look at the question of science and religion, we need to very clearly look at the genealogy of where these debates are coming from. Is it very European in that sense, or is it very Christian? Does it really work in other places? What about the Islamic context? What about the Indian context, the Buddhist context? So very different. So there isn't a particular genealogy to talk about science and religion. Yeah. So even in the European context, it's very clear that the distinction was not clearly drawn between what was science and what was religion, especially by the practitioners.
So would you say that this conflict in science and religion is just purely a Western European construct, and therefore other religious systems, whether it's in India, whether it's in China, there was no evidence of this clash between the priesthood and, I don't know, any independent body of investigators of truth or something like that?
Yeah, but that's a very difficult question to answer. But if we go with some very well established historiographers, like I'm thinking about the work of a very important historian who had spent almost 40 to 50 years of in his life just to understand the relations between science and religion, an Australian historian of science called Peter Harrison. So he wrote this wonderful book called The Territories of Science and Religion, where he clearly shows how before the 19th century, this conflict or these, first of all, these categories were in there, right? For example, the word that we can actually connect to science prior to 19th century was scientio.
Okay.
And for religion, it was what he calls as a religio. And then he analyzes these two words to argue that these two words really has no connection to today's science and religion. So it's not only that actually the word science did not exist, even the word religion did not exist, which is now a very well established thesis in disciplines such as anthropology of religion and various scholarship on history of religion, that you see that even these categories did not exist. So therefore, the conflict was completely out of question in that sense.
Okay. So in fact, just going forward, let's look at any other profession. Let's say you have, let's say there's Virat Kohli. I mean, do you ask Virat Kohli, do you believe in God? I mean, let's assume that he doesn't manifest any visible signs of it. Any other profession, let's say, I know, a cricketer, a sports person, any person. But whenever there's an ISRO launch, or, whenever a coconut is cracked, somewhere, then this, before a space launch, then this, there is this question asked at some point or the other. I mean, did those rocket scientists commit some sort of sacrilege? Are they being scientists? So do you think in this day and age, scientists have a greater burden of proof to declare their religious inclinations?
Yes, in the sense that, how scientists are actually seen as special folks. And this is a word that was used by a French anthropologist of science, actually, Bruno Latour. That, so the fact that we think that scientists should not be religious, it's coming from the idea that scientists are actually special folks. They're very different. The discipline that I come from is essentially to really challenge that kind of an idea. The scientists are not special folks. They're just like any other human beings, right? So if Virat Kohli can be a religious person, why not a scientist?
But how did it get ingrained in the popular imagination that scientists are special folk? I mean, what activities happened?
It's with the, very origin of this notion of expertise, that scientists are experts. So therefore, they have to be different. And this is especially the case in many of the post-colonial states like India, where in the beginning scientists were presented as special folks. They have to be different from others because they deal with expertise, right? I mean, it's clear from India, in the case of India, and also various other post-colonial societies, I mean, Southeast Asian countries. So it's not nothing specific to India, in fact.
Okay. So, but does it then link to how, uh, I mean, is it something to do with hierarchical cultures in India, in the sense that, I mean, going back to a previous question that I did, I mean, scientists were replacements of, priests were repositories of special knowledge, I guess. And now you say that, it's the scientists that have replaced them. So is it because of, I don't know, Indian, of Indian society, with its caste structures, regards certain people as expert and possessing privileged knowledge? Is that a
Yeah, might be the
possible way?
case. Actually, that's how many sociological and anthropological works actually demonstrates that the dominance of a particular section also can change the way how science is actually practiced in institutions. So, of course, maybe the lack of democratization can be one of the reasons.
Lack of democratization. So then, but we've been a democracy for,
Yeah.
since
Democracy not in
1947.
the political sense, but democracy in terms of, you know, inclusion, of various groups, etc. Not in the political sense of democracy, state, etc.
Okay, so then were there some special forces that facilitated such democratization in a non-Indian context, that influenced science?
By the way, it's not specific to India. This is the case everywhere, right? I mean, we are not, of course, we are talking about India, but you'll find the similar examples in all other places. Even in the United States, you'll find this kind of exclusions.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily something that is unique to India for sure.
Okay. But would you, and this is coming very specifically to your work, actually. I mean, Rennie has a very, detailed ethnographic study, the disenchantment,
Yeah,
science and religion,
in India
beyond disenchantment. So this is a very interesting approach that he took. I mean, he actually spent a year or two in IIC.
A year and a half.
So he, and you were in JNU that time, I believe.
Yes.
So he, as an STA student, as a PhD scholar, spent time at JNU, and he was purely observing scientists at work. How scientists went about their daily tasks, and he was specifically interrogative about their religious beliefs. I mean, so could you just talk about what were your experiences when you actually did that?
Well, I was as a PhD student, I was interested in this question of science and religion. So what I did fieldwork in various laboratories, not just in Bangalore, but also in Delhi, for example, various labs I did. But my major field was in Bangalore, of course. But the idea was to really look at, again, using categories from the discipline that I come from. So I wanted to understand, when we look at religion, for example, as a category, right? We always look for the places that you obviously find religion, like, a temple or a mosque or a church. But what I wanted to understand, whether that can be applicable to what I call as a non-sites of religion, like non-sites of religion where you don't really expect religion. What happens if you go to one such place and look for religion? And that's what I did. I did my field work in one of the scientific institutions in Bangalore, was looking for a religion and looking for rituals in a scientific institution to understand what kind of religious practices that happens in this institution that is different from other places.
First of all, I'm very curious. I mean, how did you pitch this proposal to the scientists in the first place? I mean, here they see this outsider guy who is technically, I'm assuming you, I think you went to a physics lab, or was it a condensed matter physics lab? Or it was completely removed from your field, right? I mean, here's a rank outsider who's going to be just, watching you, how did you even get permission for something like that? I'm very curious.
Okay, I mean, these are ethical questions I shouldn't be sharing as an anthropologist. There are certain things.
But was it, how challenging was it?
It was challenging for various reasons. First of all, the scientists did not really want to speak to non-scientists, and that's the case even now. I mean, so now the situation is different because I teach in ISER. Most of my colleagues are scientists, but that was not the case always. Right?
Yes, you're a student.
Yes,
you're a PhD
also
student.
generally scientists were not really very keen to talk to non-scientists, especially if you're an anthropologist of science. They know that it's going to be critical of what they do. But the essential idea of the discipline of anthropology science is to make science more democratic. It is not necessarily criticism. For example, as the person that I have just quoted, Bruno Latour, the French anthropologist, said something very fascinating, which really captures the discipline. That when in literary, you have scholars who write fictions. They're literary scholars, but you also have literary criticism. You see, which is well taken for seriously. Actually, literary critics are one of the most important critics, but we don't really take science critics seriously. So what STAs do is essentially that it's a science critic, just like literary critic. So literary critics enjoys the literature and of course do the criticism. STA scholars do the same thing.
Are critics of science viewed differently in the West as opposed to India? I mean, do you have any?
In the US, I mean, also in Europe generally, the discipline of science and technology is kind of well established. So most of the universities, you think about some of the finest institutions in the world. MIT, for example, has the best STS department, and any other universities you can name. But when it comes to India, STS as a discipline is, first of all, the discipline of anthropology itself, is not very taken seriously by institutions. And within that, there is this specialization of STS is not necessarily taken seriously by the institution. So it's still a very new discipline with a great history and genealogy. This is a discipline that emerged in India since the 1960s, much before actually STS as a discipline started in UK and other places. So that history is not written. There are fascinating scholars like J.P.A. Subroi, who died last year, was a professor at the Delhi School of Economic Sociology. Shiv Vishwanathan and various others actually have started this discipline of sociology almost in the 1970s and late 60s. So, but yes, institutionally speaking, there isn't much acceptance of a discipline like STS. I don't know the reason, but I think maybe the scientist colleagues would be happy to. They should. They should
probably
know better than me.
Sound that out in the audience. But coming back to your experience, so okay, you're in the lab and you're permitted to be an observer. What did you find out about the religious lives of the scientists you were interacting with?
First of all, it's not a homogeneous, way of saying that this is how scientists believe, etc. It's more complicated than that.
I mean, you can narrate a few examples, I guess.
Okay. So, in my experience, my interlocutors really don't find much. I mean, in terms of they don't find science and religion very conflictual. For various reasons, actually. They argue that actually it makes them more spiritual. And in fact, one of the very important scientists told me that actually the fact that he is able to do good science because he's spiritual.
Spiritual?
Yeah. So, of course, I mean, one of the things that I have noticed in my work is that the scientists, because of the fact that they already mentioned about their identity as experts, they also try to present their religion and faith very differently from the general community, the general public. Or for example, they would say that we are religious, but we are more rational. So we are rationally religious. So in my book, I have a category that I call as rational believers.
Wow.
Rational believers. So they say basically that we are rational believers, scientists with some rational understanding of religion, very different from actually the lay folks. And they give various examples, like that we wouldn't really like to go to a temple to see the sanctum sanctorum. It doesn't really matter. We can just go to the premises and believe that the God has seen us. It's not necessary to be there, yet we can be religious. So they actually, very interestingly, for an anthropologist, it's really fascinating because they talk about different forms of religiosity. Right, so there is a form of rational belief. Some of them are spiritual, not believers. Spiritual, not
Would
religious.
spiritual be opposed to rational? I mean,
no, the rational is included in the spiritual, but the spiritual is not religious.
Wow.
So
in a rich, I mean, so did many of them come out as saying we are not ritualistic? I mean, we don't abide by the classical rituals of our religion.
So ritualistic is, they say it's not part of the scientific life.
Okay.
So the fact that you can be ritualistic is very clearly identified as a belief system of the non-scientists.
Did you see this as an example of something that you referred to earlier, that scientists saying we are special folk? So
Exactly.
even in our religious outlook towards science, we are special folk. Did you see that?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, they clearly make this distinction between what I call as their belief and our belief. Okay, so the scientists have very different notion of belief.
Yeah.
I must say that I can't really generalize. I'm an anthropologist. I'm speaking only from the field that I have studied. It shouldn't be the case in TFR or other places, right? Institutional cultures are very different. I also studied NCBS. So different institutions actually have different cultures of belief as well. It's not that all scientists believe in similar manner, etc.
But surely there would be a wide variety within an institute itself, right?
Yes, absolutely. One institution, of course, the institute that I have studied had different kinds of beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
There are spirituals, there are ritualistics, there are religious, not ritualistic, spiritual but not religious, various kinds of categories. And the most prominent ones are actually the rational believers.
The rational believers. So, I mean, what do these rational believers say? As in, like, how do they describe?
Yeah. Should I read an excerpt from the book?
I'll be happy.
Because there's a very interesting.
Yes, please.
Geneticist, actually. So, of course, all the names are not real names because that's how we write names. So, his name is Siddhartha, who's a geneticist. And so he's a very deeply religious scientist who does, of course, puja and visits temple every week. However, like various other scientists that I have discussed, he argued that he's different from the general public in the way he thinks and performs religion. So he said, I've got him. There is a difference between scientists and the general public. For example, when I go to temple and pilgrimage centers, what I see is a rush to go near to the sanctum sanctorum. People want to be there physically, but I don't do that. I don't think it is required. For example, in Tirupati, most of the time I skip, but he goes, I skip the line. I don't go to see the sanctum sanctorum. I always stay outside and pray. It's not important to go to the line and see the sanctum sanctorum. In fact, what's important is to go to the temple premises, not necessary that one should go inside and pray in front of the sanctum sanctorum. I pray from outside the temple and then come back. I don't think that I am less blessed than those who go inside the temple.
Okay.
Right. So he's actually very clearly trying to also scientify. In my book, of course, I discuss the process of what I call a scientification of religion.
Scientification of religion.
Scientification of religion. So they try to really scientify some of their practices and how that's very different from the lay believers. Mm-hmm. So these are various strategies actually I argue that they make to be happy that they are believers, but also at the same time they are doing absolutely brilliant science.
Did you in your book probe? Surely because these are scientists, they know all the arguments against, atheism and the conflict in religion and science. Why do you think some scientists in your interviews had to jump around intellectual hoops to kind of justify their belief? Do you think it was more like this was a belief that they always had and they felt a greater need to justify it, or was this a belief that they feel that they had to somehow convince? They knew that they felt there were some mistakes, they felt there was something wrong somewhere, but you have to justify it. What is the sense that you got from?
Yeah, when it comes to these kind of questions, of course, there's a standard way they replay, right? That religion is completely different from science, and they don't need to really look at religion from a scientific point of view. For example, the question of does God exist? That's not a question that concerns them at all. They argue that it's not important to us. Mm-hmm. We believe, but this question is not important. So not everything has to be justified through science. This is what they say.
Okay.
And also, most importantly, when the institution itself has a culture of acceptance of a particular belief system, these questions don't really come, right? Because it's not, of course, for outsiders, it will be. It's a concern. It's a question when we go to these institutions. But there is already a largely accepted culture, what I call as culture of the institution, which kind of accepts these beliefs and practices.
Okay.
So it's not something that they need to prove on an everyday basis.
Okay. And just to step back a little bit into the history of this. I mean, you've recounted instances of scientists in labs and their religious belief. I mean, just before that, if I'm just to finish my train of thought, did you actually encounter the atheist scientist over there, or scientists who believe that I'm a scientist, therefore this is this is not, God is not valid or something like that? What were your experiences with folks like that?
Uh, the presence of atheists, of course. I mean, one of my chapters is titled "Being Atheistic, Being Scientific: Scientists as Atheists." So I document the lived experiences of atheist scientists in that institution and how they actually practice atheism very differently.
Oh, really?
Right?
So even in their atheism, they're different from
Yeah.
you and I atheist. I mean, the common atheist. Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, in the sense that how they also try to sometimes culturalize the atheists' practices, so that they don't need to. I mean, there are instances where I heard ask questions around, like for example, marriage, and then how they have to justify by saying that, well, it's really cultural. Even if you marry from your own caste, but it is still cultural. So atheism works in very differently. Actually, anyways, this is also something that in the social science scholarship now it's very clear that atheism also it takes us very differently in different places. How site and places actually shape the way actually practice atheism. So it's not necessarily always textual, just like religion.
Okay.
So there the lived experiences of the atheists and the lived experiences of the believers. In that sense, have certain things in common.
But did you ever have people who gave arguments against justifying why they didn't believe in a God, or you didn't really probe that?
Yes, of course. There are scientists, especially evolutionary biologists, that I have encountered in all the places. Yes, they do have
And
reservation on
that thing was, okay, evolution,
yeah.
shows us very evidently there's no need for a
the
divine.
presence of a divine. Yes.
So which is the kind of standard I mean, a conventional argument to
Yeah.
even a common people atheist argument, I guess, against against the existence of a creator.
Yeah. And I didn't really find, of course, Darwin is still an important person for them, but not Dawkins.
Not
Richard Dawkins. Richard
really?
Dawkins is not necessarily, even the atheist scientists that I have spoke with, they were not big fans of actually Richard Dawkins, but Darwin is.
Interesting. And did you probe them for that? Why? I mean, given that Richard Dawkins is the bulldog of atheism,
it's also because
time.
of I think it's also because of the institutional culture where they wanted to accommodate everyone.
Okay.
So the atheist scientists very clearly told me that they're okay with their, students and colleagues being religious. So they in fact go for these rituals and practice and participate.
Yes.
That is not maybe an atheist in the Dawkins tradition would do.
Okay.
So it's not rejection, but participation, yet keep a distance.
So in that sense, I would actually find that in terms of the, the non-believing scientist or the atheistic scientist or the agnostic scientist, they actually seem very much like the common folk atheism. That is, I don't believe it, but I'm willing to accommodate some another's belief, and that is very. I mean, that's a stance like many. It's the tolerance stance, I guess. So that is so. There is no special focusism in their atheism, I guess.
Yeah, that's exactly why we should challenge this idea that scientists are special.
Exactly. So that comes to that point. And so in just to go back a little bit into history, what do we know, or I mean, do we have any interesting details of the early colonial era Indian scientists, say C.V. Raman or a Jagdish Bose or a Meghnad Saha? I mean, what do we know about their religious lives? And do we know if their religious lives had bearing on this? Because that time the science-religion debate was a little bit, I guess, more volatile, I guess, that time. So do we know, what does the scholarship say on something like this?
Yes, I mean, now we have historians, actually, Deepak Kumar, various others have written about it. It's very clear that all of them have lived in their cultural tradition that they come from. They didn't really oppose very clearly, right? One exception is, of course, Amen Saha. Because Yaman Saha was also very clear about, because he wanted to challenge some superstitious beliefs and practices, and also because he was very much against caste practices in places, because he himself, he comes from a non-dominant caste, right?
Yeah.
So therefore, he used actually his science to fight against caste and caste practices, which is related to religion. So other than that, many of the scientists of the time were influenced by the faith and religion that they come from. I mean, you mentioned C.V. Raman. We can think of, uh, various other besides the scientists, colonial Bengali scientists were mostly actually trying to really combine their religious tradition and their scientific practices. So
they didn't try to combine.
They did.
They did.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Oh, they did. So then, I mean, in what?
It's not something that did it intentionally.
Okay.
But that's also because the cultural worldview that they were part of.
Okay.
You see, I mean.
So we can. So in summary, I can get a sense that the Indian scientist milieu. I mean, where science is practiced, there is the domain of science and I mean, as a way of knowledge, and there is culture. I mean, culture trumps. Would you agree? Culture trumps the way you are conditioned to believe about religion and science. And is that unique from the Western experience?
It's difficult to say that it's unique actually compared to the Western experiences, because even in the West, actually, you see many such cases, especially coming from the American, the debate on creationism and evolutionism. Even though it's very clear that the scientists are not, they don't really openly say that they're religious in the public institutions, but there are cases, some of the well-established scientists are openly religious, actually.
Sure.
But only thing is that maybe, those places, the institutions don't really accommodate these practices.
Oh, they don't? Okay.
Yeah, most of the places they don't. But maybe in India, there is.
We are more accommodative
yeah. And that's also because, as I said, it has to do with the culture of these institutions as well.
Okay. And I know I said closing in first, but in closing, is there any scholarship that suggests that, because of a general tolerance of various religious views in Indian scientific institutions, has anybody made any correlation between scientific output, or does it affect the practice of science per se, or I don't know, the kind of science that people choose to pursue in terms of, I guess, the daringness of certain ideas? Is there any work on that, or is it something that is
not specific to the question that you have asked, but there are works that looks at how the personal religious practices really affect, the scientists, maybe the way in which they interact with fellow colleagues and students, those kind of work, but not necessarily the work per se. But there are cases where you also see how the religion shapes the way they deal with the everyday life.
Okay.
In the sense that there are auspicious days and inauspicious days. They might not be, for example, submitting a paper on an inauspicious day, but they might submit one day before. So it's not really affecting their work.
So there are auspicious days to switch on the collider, I guess, and not some.
Yeah, but again, this is something that you'll find in all the places, by the way. I mean, it's not specific to India.
Great. So thank you, everybody. So I wanted to open the floor. We've got time for a couple of questions. So anybody wants to quiz Rennie on this? Lots of hands. Yes, I will actually. Okay, let's start with Vinita there. I'll just go like this, in terms of.
If you were to speculate based on your experience, the ISRO scientist who looked at Muhurtam before the thing fired, in what category would you put them? As religious rationalists and whatever else that you talked about? Speculation, but since you have experience, I wondered whether those scientists can be categorized for common understanding.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, actually. It's a difficult question.
That's why we're asking you.
Yeah,
because as a science journalist, we ask difficult questions.
So I have a student who is writing a PhD thesis on the social history of ISRO, where he has a chapter on this. So hopefully by the time he submits, there'll be something. Yeah.
So we should wait for a student.
Yes, I don't have an answer.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, you can have Vinay.
So my question is, like I'll slightly move from a comment first that when we started this sort of religion and Indian science, Tumba and Vikram Sarabhai, then we had J.N. Tata and Swami Vivekanand actually putting in funds for Indian Institute of Science to come up with. From that to coming to the present days, where do you see any sort of pattern coming out for scientists to not explicitly talk about their religious preferences or their views because of the extremism or the fascism which is prevalent nowadays in terms of politics and all of these scenarios?
Yes and no. Right, there are cases where scientists don't really talk about their personal beliefs and practices because of these external reasons. But there are also scientists who really opens up and they really talk about they're very proud of their tradition and religion. It's not a black and white in that sense. And of course, since you have mentioned, Tumba, I think it is really interesting to see that history, how it's in today's. I don't know how many of you have visited the Tumba Space Museum. It's really a fascinating place. It was once a church. So that was donated to ISRO because of Vikram Sarabhai and his Kalam and others. So now it's a museum, but the structure is still there. So that's an interesting case to really look at how science and religion actually works very differently in the Indian context. I think this is where we need to really look at the historical specificity of the places. That's what I was trying to argue before, that the larger question of science and religion it doesn't really answer, right? We need to look at which place that we are talking about. And then you see the cultural specificities of the ways in which the practice religion and also practice science very differently.
Okay, I have time for two more questions. And I have many hands up. So Neha, you're closer. I'll come to you last.
Okay. So mostly today you have talked about scientists and their personal religious views. But for example, sometimes scientists work with communities, right? And in those cases, it is quite important for them to recognize the religious views of the communities they are working with. This is especially true when we are working in areas where indigenous knowledge systems are being adopted. Like, I think currently there's a lot of interest in taking up traditional knowledge systems. But if we are taking that without understanding the sensibilities of the communities involved, for example, biodiverse places, like if we are just using them as resources without understanding that the community sees them as something divine. So here there is the fact that maybe the scientists themselves, they are considering that I am rational, I am not religious, or maybe they have this sense of otherness, that it is only their religious views which are
Sure.
important. So how do we address these biases? Because I think this bias will be true for both religious scientists as well as non-religious scientists.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, I mean the binary was not that they're rational, therefore not religious. They're rational yet religious. So that was the case in this particular case. But and you're absolutely right, especially if you're studying scientists, what we call the field scientists, so the environmental scientists, ecologists, it's going to be a different case. They need to really understand the community first. So Shalini is here, she understands a lot of fascinating works on that ground also happens, where you need to understand the people's everyday beliefs and practices, right? That's clearly there is no doubt about it. So there has to be different ways of therefore approaching these questions. Since I was looking at an institution, and I was studying a scientific laboratory, which is different from a field. And a field requires different kind of training, and also the people, you have to take the people for very seriously and their religious beliefs and practices. And in this particular case, I was talking about scientists who are like practicing scientists in the laboratories. So that is an extremely important question, but that, yes, the distinction has to be made.
Okay, last question for Biju. Take this, yeah.
Rini, just want to know one thing, whether scientists are religious or superstitious, because whenever we speak about religious thing, we speak about the ISRO case, like scientists breaking the coconut and the same thing. But the same thing happens in NASA, where the astronauts go and urinate. I think that during that time, somebody out of tension urinated there, and then they became successful. We want something as a point of reference for the success. Are they copying this for their success?
No, they are not copying because this is a practice since 1970s actually. It's there. But yes, you're right. I mean, it's difficult to, first of all, it's difficult to really categorize what is religious, what is superstitious in the Indian context, especially. In fact, that's why some of the scientists come forward to say that they are religious, but they are not superstitious. So the distinctions are clearly used in the everyday laboratory life to convince themselves that they're doing good science, but they're also believers, and they're very happy with that actually. Even the atheist scientists that I describe in my book, what I call as, they are atheists in a very cultural manner. So they practice everything that a believer does, but it's just that they might not believe in God in the sense a believer does, but otherwise he believes in everything else.
So great. So thanks a lot. We've had a very wide, diverse array of questions. And thanks a lot, Rennie,
Thank you,
for
yeah.
taking up all of these
Thank you.
questions and spending time with us. Thank you all.